Growing up in the small, rural town of Fall River, Maine, Emma had always felt secure. Her home sat on the edge of the woods, a vast expanse of trees stretching for miles behind the house. While most people found the isolation unnerving, Emma had always loved it. The quiet, the rustling of the leaves, the occasional call of an owl, it was peaceful. That peace was shattered one cold October night. It was a Saturday, and Emma was home alone while her parents attended a late-night event in town. They wouldn't be back until after midnight, so she decided to settle in with a good book and a cup of tea. By 9 p.m. the wind had started to pick up, rattling the windows and making the house feel even more isolated than usual. Emma tried to ignore the growing unease in the pit of her stomach. She was used to being alone in the house, she'd done it dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, a tension she couldn't quite shake. Around 10 p.m., just as she was beginning to get drowsy, she heard it, a faint cry, distant but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the woods. She froze, straining her ears to listen. At first, she thought it was an animal, a coyote or maybe a fox, but then she heard it again. This time, it was clearer, more distinct. It was a human cry. Heart pounding, Emma got up and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The thick trees made it impossible to see much beyond the edge of the yard, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the tree line, calling for help. The cry came again, louder now. Help. Please. Emma's mind raced. It was late, the woods were vast, and the nearest neighbor lived over a mile away. Could someone really be lost out there? She grabbed her phone and dialed her mom, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried her dad's number with the same result. Panic set in. Should she call the police? What if it was a prank, or worse, what if someone was in real trouble? Another cry. This time, it was even closer. Help me. Against her better judgment, Emma grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cautiously opened the back door. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the desperate sound of someone's voice. She hesitated on the porch, fear gnawing at her, but the thought of someone hurt or lost in the woods pushed her forward. Hello? She called out, her voice trembling as she stepped off the porch and onto the cold, damp grass. Who's there? No answer, just the wind, and the rustling of the leaves. She took a few more steps, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, scanning the edge of the woods. The trees loomed tall and menacing in the night, their branches swaying like skeletal fingers. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she edged closer to the tree line. Help me. The voice came again, weaker this time. She aimed the flashlight into the dense foliage, her heart pounding in her chest. Where are you? Nothing. Just as she was about to turn back, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, thin, pale, and disheveled, with wild, unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd been torn by the branches. He stumbled toward her, clutching his side as though he was injured. Please, he gasped, his voice hoarse. Help me. Emma's instincts screamed at her to run, but something about the man's frailty made her stay. He looked like he'd been through hell. What happened? She asked, taking a cautious step toward him. I got lost, he stammered, his eyes wide and frantic. I've been out here for hours. I didn't think anyone would find me. Emma felt a wave of sympathy wash over her. She stepped closer, holding out her hand. It's okay, I'll call for help. Before she could dial, the man's expression shifted. His wide eyes narrowed, and a slow, unsettling smile crept across his face. You shouldn't have come out here, he said, his voice suddenly calm, almost mocking. Emma's blood ran cold. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but her feet felt glued to the ground. I'm going back inside, she stammered, backing away slowly. The man took a step toward her. It's too late for that. Without another word, Emma turned and bolted for the house, her heart thundering in her chest. The flashlight slipped from her grasp as she ran, plunging her into darkness, but she didn't dare stop. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps fast and deliberate, closing the gap between them. She reached the porch and slammed the door behind her, locking it just as his hand hit the glass. Emma stumbled back, gasping for air, her entire body trembling with fear. Through the window, she could see him standing there, staring at her with that same eerie smile. He raised his hand, placing it flat against the glass, and mouthed the words, "I'll be back." Emma didn't sleep that night, and when her parents returned, she told them everything. They called the police, but when they searched the woods, there was no sign of the man. No footprints, no torn clothes, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. But Emma knew what she'd seen. And from that night on, she never felt safe in Fall River again. Maria had always loved the quiet comfort of her small town, where everyone knew each other and life moved at a steady, predictable pace. That changed when the house next door was sold. It had been vacant for years, falling into disrepair with broken windows and a yard overtaken by weeds. Then, seemingly overnight, the for sale sign vanished, and new neighbors moved in. She had expected to meet them at some point, but days passed, and no one came out. There were no cars in the driveway, no packages on the porch, just silence. Maria's curiosity grew as she watched the house from her kitchen window, wondering about the people who had moved in. They must have been coming and going at strange hours, always slipping away unseen. Something about it just didn't sit right with her. The only sign of life came at night. Every evening, around 10 p.m. a dim light flickered on in the upstairs window, illuminating the house for just an hour before turning off again. Maria found it odd, considering the total lack of activity during the day. She had never once heard a door slam, footsteps on the porch, or the sound of a television. The house remained a mystery, silent and dark except for that one brief hour. At first, Maria thought maybe the neighbors were just private people, and she tried to ignore her growing sense of unease. But as the weeks passed, the nightly light show began to gnaw at her. The light wasn't just dim, it flickered irregularly, as though it was struggling to stay on, casting eerie shadows across the walls of the empty rooms. Something was off about it, something unnatural. One particularly stormy night, Maria sat in her living room, the wind howling against the windows. The rain came down in torrents, and the power flickered off and on. She glanced at the clock, 10:03 p.m. instinctively, her eyes darted to the neighbor's house. Sure enough, through the sheets of rain, she could see the light flicker on in the upstairs window. But this time, there was something else. Something moving in the shadows. Maria squinted, trying to make out what it was. A figure? A person? Her heart raced, a strange mix of fear and curiosity urging her to get a better look. She grabbed her flashlight and raincoat, fully aware that going outside during a storm wasn't her brightest idea. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that house. Stepping into the cold, driving rain, Maria made her way across her yard, her shoes sinking into the muddy grass. The wind whipped against her face as she crossed the street, her eyes locked on the glowing window. The light flickered erratically, almost as if it were calling her toward it. When she reached the sidewalk in front of the neighbor's house, Maria stopped, hesitating for a moment. The house loomed over her, dark and silent except for that single flickering window. She lifted her flashlight and pointed it toward the upstairs room. Her breath caught in her throat. There, framed in the dim light, was the silhouette of a person, a tall, gaunt figure standing perfectly still, facing the window. The light from the room cast long shadows across the figure's body, making it look almost skeletal. Maria's pulse quickened. She couldn't make out any details, but the figure stood unnervingly still, as if it were watching her. The figure's head slowly turned toward the window, and though she couldn't see its face, Maria felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She took a step back, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Suddenly, the light in the window flickered out, plunging the house into complete darkness. Maria gasped and stumbled back, her flashlight beam shaking in her trembling hand. The figure was gone. The window was dark. She hurried back to her house, her mind racing. Was it possible she had just seen one of the neighbors? Why would someone stand in the window like that? It didn't make sense. But there was no denying the fear that had gripped her as she stood there, face to face with the silhouette. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flickering light and the figure standing still, watching. She convinced herself it was just a coincidence, a trick of the light, maybe. There had to be a logical explanation. The next day, Maria decided to get some answers. She walked over to the neighbor's house and knocked on the door. No response. She knocked again, harder this time, but still, no one answered. The house was silent. She peered through the front window, pressing her face against the glass. The inside of the house was dark, and as far as she could see, completely empty. There was no furniture, no signs of life, nothing. It was as if no one had ever lived there. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Had she imagined everything? The light, the figure. Just then, a voice startled her from behind. "Can I help you?" She spun around to see a man standing on the sidewalk, an older gentleman who lived a few doors down. I was just trying to see if anyone was home," she stammered, gesturing toward the house. The man's expression darkened. "No one's lived there in years. The house has been abandoned since the last owner passed away." Maria felt her stomach drop. But I've seen lights. Every night, at 10 p.m. the light comes on in the upstairs window. I've even seen someone standing there." The man shook his head. "You must be mistaken. There's no power running to that house. Hasn't been for years." Maria stood there, stunned, as the man walked away. The house stood before her, as silent and empty as ever, its windows dark and cold. That night, Maria kept her curtains closed and her lights on. But just after 10 p.m. curiosity got the best of her. She peeked out through the blinds, her heart pounding in her chest. And there it was, the faint flicker of a light in the upstairs window. And the figure, standing perfectly still, watching. In the small, rural town of Grey Hollow, life had a way of blending into the mundane. Every day felt the same, quiet, slow, and uneventful. Emily had grown up there and knew its rhythms well. Her family lived in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by wide fields of tall grass that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The nearest neighbor's house stood across the field, a dilapidated two-story structure that had been vacant for as long as she could remember. As a child, Emily had always been curious about the house. Her parents would tell her not to go near it, insisting it was unsafe and that the owners had left long ago. But the more they warned her, the more intrigued she became. From her bedroom window, she had a perfect view of the house across the field, and she spent many nights staring at it, wondering what secrets it held. One late summer evening, just as the sun was setting, Emily noticed something strange. As the sky darkened, a faint glow began to emanate from one of the windows on the second floor of the abandoned house. She squinted, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, there it was, a soft, flickering light. It looked like the warm glow of a candle, casting long shadows across the cracked windowpane. She called her parents into her room to show them, but by the time they arrived, the light had vanished. They dismissed it as a reflection of the setting sun, but Emily wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, the light appeared again at the same time every night, faint at first, but growing stronger each time. Emily became obsessed, watching the house like a hawk. On the fifth night, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. Her parents were out for the evening, and her younger brother was already asleep. With her heart racing, she grabbed a flashlight and slipped on her sneakers. The distance between her house and the one across the field wasn't far, but it felt like miles as she made her way through the tall, swaying grass. The wind whispered around her, and the sky had grown overcast, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The house loomed larger as she approached, its once white paint now peeling and weathered. The windows were caked with grime, and the porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. But the light in the upstairs window was unmistakable, soft, golden, and unnatural in the darkened structure. As she reached the front porch, Emily hesitated. The air felt different here, heavy with a strange, oppressive energy. She could feel her pulse quickening, but curiosity overpowered her fear. She climbed the creaking steps, the wooden boards groaning under her weight. When she reached the front door, she gently pushed it open. The inside of the house smelled of dust and rot, as if the walls themselves were decaying. Emily shined her flashlight around the room, revealing broken furniture, shattered glass, and years of neglect. But the light from upstairs beckoned her, flickering through the gaps in the floorboards above. She ascended the stairs slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. The closer she got to the second floor, the more intense the flickering light became, as if it were alive, pulling her in. When she reached the landing, she followed the glow to a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed the door open. The room was empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just peeling wallpaper and a cold, damp draft coming through the broken window. But the light was there, suspended in the center of the room, flickering like a dying candle. It wasn't coming from a lamp or any visible source, it seemed to hang in the air, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. As Emily stepped closer, the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and her skin prickled with goosebumps. The light seemed to pulsate, growing brighter with every step she took. Then, suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emily froze. The temperature plummeted further, and a deep, guttural whisper filled the room. It was unintelligible at first, just a low rumble that reverberated through the walls. But as Emily strained to listen, the voice became clearer. "Go away." Her blood ran cold. The voice was not human, raspy, broken, and filled with malice. Emily spun around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. The room was empty, yet the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding her. Suddenly, the flickering light shot up toward the ceiling, illuminating the entire room. And that's when she saw it. Etched into the walls were names, hundreds of them, scratched into the plaster as if by a desperate hand. Some were faded and worn, while others were fresh, the plaster still crumbling around the edges. Before she could react, the light flared again, and a figure appeared in the corner of the room, a dark silhouette, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. The figure was barely human, its limbs long and twisted, its face a grotesque mask of rage and despair. Emily's legs refused to move. She was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear as the figure slowly began to move toward her, its limbs creaking and bending unnaturally. The whispering grew louder, filling her head with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Go away before it's too late." Finally, Emily's body responded. She turned and bolted for the door, yanking it open and racing down the stairs. The house seemed to shift and groan around her, the walls closing in as she stumbled toward the front door. She burst out into the cold night air, her lungs burning as she ran back through the field, never daring to look back. When she finally reached her house, she slammed the door behind her and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. Her parents returned later that night, finding her pale and trembling in her room. She tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out. The next morning, Emily looked out her window at the house across the field. The light was gone. The house was dark and still, just as it had always been. But she knew what she had seen. And the names on the wall, those names were real. Later that week, she overheard her parents talking with a neighbor about the old house. "Terrible thing," the neighbor said. "Family disappeared without a trace. Some say they were taken. Others say they just left everything behind." Emily never went near the house again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the fields, she swore she could still see that faint flicker of light, just a reminder of what waited in the darkness. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.